June 22, 2022, 4 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, 200 nautical miles off Samar Island. Victor Vescovo's hands moved across the controls of the DSV limiting factor submersible as sonar returns painted an impossible image on his screens. This cannot be here, not at this depth. The magnetometer had detected ferrous material at 22,621 feet, deeper than any shipwreck ever discovered. Vescovo adjusted the submersible's external lights, and through the observation viewport, twisted metal emerged from the darkness. A hull number appeared through decades of marine growth, 413. USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE 413. The destroyer escort sat upright on the seafloor, her bow pointed southwest, the same direction she'd been steaming when 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Kongō had torn her engine room apart 78 years earlier. Her twin 5-inch gun mounts remained trained to starboard, frozen in their final firing position. The 40-foot gash in her starboard side gaped like a mortal wound that had never healed. Vescovo examined the wreckage through his viewport. The ship measured just 306 feet long, barely longer than a football field. Her displacement had been 1,745 tons. By comparison, the Japanese battleship Yamato, which had hunted her on October 25, 1944, displaced 72,000 tons and measured 862 feet. The Yamato's main guns fired 3,300-pound shells that could obliterate a ship this size with a single hit from 19 miles away. The Samuel B. Roberts' largest weapons were 2 5-inch guns designed to fight submarines, not battleships. Yet on that October morning in 1944, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland had given the order that defined his ship's legacy: commence firing on the cruiser, we'll go down fighting. The discovery of the Samuel B. Roberts at record depth would prove what naval historians had long suspected. The battle off Samar represented not merely an act of desperation, but a calculated tactical aggression that leveraged technological advantages, specifically radar fire control systems, to compensate for overwhelming material inferiority. 7 American warships, the 4 destroyer escorts M3 destroyers of Task Unit 77.4.3, had charged the most powerful surface fleet Japan assembled after Midway. They fought battleships with submarine guns. They survived through audacity, technology, and a psychological miscalculation that convinced Japanese Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita he faced Admiral William F. Halsey's main carrier force rather than escort carriers built on Liberty ship hulls. The mathematics of that engagement defied every principle of naval warfare, yet the Samuel B. Roberts and her sister ships won. The journey to this revelation had begun 3 years earlier when the United States Navy confronted a fundamental problem. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than American shipyards could replace them. The Battle of the Atlantic demanded hundreds of anti-submarine vessels, but fleet destroyers cost $6 million each and required 18 months to build. The Navy needed something cheaper, faster to produce, and expendable. The solution arrived in February 1943 when the Maritime Commission approved the destroyer escort program. These ships would displace just 1,400 to 1,750 tons, 1/3 the size of fleet destroyers. They would carry weapons designed exclusively for anti-submarine warfare, depth charges, hedgehog projectors, and 5-inch guns adequate for engaging surfaced U-boats but useless against armored warships. Their diesel-electric or turbo-electric power plants would generate just 12,000 horsepower, limiting speed to 24 knots maximum. The Samuel B. Roberts, designated DE 413, was laid down at Brown Shipbuilding Company in Houston, Texas, on December 6, 1943. She belonged to the John C. Butler class, featuring 2 5-inch by 38 caliber guns in single mounts, 3 40mm quad anti-aircraft mounts, 10 20mm guns, 3 21-inch torpedo tubes, and 8 depth-charge projectors. Her main battery could engage surface targets at approximately 7 miles. Beyond that range, her shells lacked sufficient velocity to penetrate even light cruiser armor. She commissioned on April 28, 1944, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Robert Witcher Copeland, a 1934 Naval Academy graduate who had spent most of the war teaching gunnery at the Naval Academy. Her crew numbered 224 officers and men, most of whom had never experienced combat. The ship bore the name Coxswain Samuel Booker Roberts, Jr., who had died covering the evacuation of Marines at Guadalcanal in September 1942. By October 1944, the Samuel B. Roberts had joined Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague. The unit comprised 6 escort carriers, CVE, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay. Each escort carrier displaced 7,800 tons and carried approximately 28 aircraft. They had been converted from Maritime Commission C-3 cargo hulls, the same basic design as Liberty ships. Their maximum speed was 18 knots. Their armor consisted of thin steel plating, adequate for protecting against splinter damage, nothing more. Screening these 6 carriers were 7 warships, 3 fleet destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond. These 13 ships constituted one of 16 escort carrier groups providing close air support for General Douglas MacArthur's invasion of Leyte in the central Philippines. The American plan assumed Japanese surface forces would approach through either San Bernardino Strait to the north or Surigao Strait to the south. Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet, including the fast battleships and fleet carriers, would engage any force attempting San Bernardino. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid's Seventh Fleet would cover Surigao. The escort carrier groups would focus on ground support missions. But both admirals assumed covering forces would remain at the strait. No covering forces remained. At approximately 0001 hours on October 25, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita led the Japanese center force through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. His force represented the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since the Battle of Midway, the battleships Yamato, Nagato, Kongō, and Haruna, the heavy cruisers Haguro, Chōkai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Tone, the light cruisers Yahagi and Noshiro, and 11 destroyers. Combined, these vessels mounted 42 guns ranging from 14-inch to 18.1-inch caliber. The Yamato alone carried 9 18.1-inch guns capable of firing 3,300-pound armor-piercing shells to a range of 42,000 yards, approximately 19 nautical miles. Kurita's orders were explicit: destroy the American invasion fleet off Leyte Gulf. At 0637 hours on October 25, lookouts aboard the escort carrier White Plains spotted pagoda masts on the northwestern horizon. Ensign William C. Brooks, who had been scanning that sector with binoculars, later recalled, "I saw what looked like a forest of masts. I counted 4 battleships. I couldn't believe what I was seeing." The most powerful battleship force in the Japanese Navy was steaming at 26 knots directly towards 6 defenseless escort carriers. Between those carriers and certain destruction stood Admiral Sprague's 7 screening vessels, ships designed to hunt submarines, not fight battleships. What followed became known as the Battle off Samar. It remains the only engagement in modern naval history where destroyer escorts charged battleships. At 7:01 a.m., Admiral Clifton Sprague issued the call every carrier admiral dreaded: Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of this formation. He immediately ordered the escort carriers to turn southeast at flank speed and launched every available aircraft. He ordered his screening vessels, the 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, to prepare to attack. The order defied naval doctrine. Screening vessels facing superior forces were expected to lay smoke screens and protect the carriers through deception and maneuver. Direct attack against battleships invited annihilation. But Sprague recognized that deception alone could not save his carriers. The Japanese fleet could maintain 26 knots. His escort carriers could make 18 knots maximum. The enemy would overtake them within 90 minutes. At 7:15 hours, the battleship Yamato opened fire at a range of approximately 34,000 yards, 17 nautical miles. Her 18.1-inch shells weighed more than a Volkswagen Beetle. They created geysers 150 feet high when they landed. Each shell could penetrate 16 inches of armor plate at 20 miles. The escort carriers had no armor plate. At 7:16, Commander Ernest E. Evans, aboard the destroyer Johnston, made the decision that would earn him a posthumous Medal of Honor. Without waiting for orders, he turned directly toward the Japanese fleet and increased to flank speed. "Commence firing on the leading heavy cruiser," he ordered. "We're going in." The Johnston represented the most powerful vessel in Taffy 3's screen. As a Fletcher-class destroyer, she displaced 2,700 tons and mounted 5 5-inch guns in single turrets. She carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. Her turbines could drive her at 38 knots. She was designed to fight other destroyers and light cruisers, not battleships and heavy cruisers, displacing 5 to 10 times her tonnage. At 07:27, the Johnston fired her entire spread of 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano from a range of 10,000 yards, 5 nautical miles. Commander Evans then turned to parallel the Japanese fleet, bringing his 5 5-inch guns to bear. The Johnston's Mark 37 gunfire control system, a radar-directed fire control computer weighing 3,000 pounds, continuously calculated range, bearing, target speed, and shell ballistics. The system allowed the Johnston's guns to maintain accurate fire even during radical evasive maneuvers. At 07:28, one of the Johnston's torpedoes struck Kumano's bow, blowing off the cruiser's entire forward section. Kumano immediately fell out of formation and withdrew, listing heavily. The Johnston had eliminated 1 heavy cruiser in a single torpedo attack. At 07:30, Admiral Sprague ordered the destroyers Hole and Heerman to join Johnston's attack. He ordered the 4 destroyer escorts, including Samuel B. Roberts, to lay smokescreen and stand by to attack. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, understood the implications. His ship carried 3 torpedoes in a triple mount. His 2 5-inch guns could fire 14 rounds per minute combined. His main battery fire control was the same Mark 37 system that gave the Johnston her accuracy advantage. But he had no radar to aid his guns. His ship displaced 1,745 tons. His maximum speed was 24 knots. His armor consisted of splinter plating adequate to stop shrapnel, nothing more. At 07:50, with Japanese shells landing within 1,000 yards of the escort carriers, Copeland gave the order that defined his ship's legacy. "All ahead flank. Commence torpedo attack. We're going in." The Samuel B. Roberts turned northwest and accelerated to maximum speed. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Trowbridge Roberts opened the throttles beyond their designed limits. The ship's 2 General Motors diesel-electric engines, rated for 12,000 horsepower, produced nearly 13,000. The Samuel B. Roberts reached 28 knots, 4 knots above her rated maximum speed. At 08:05, with Japanese heavy cruisers Chōkai and Chikuma bracketing his ship with 8-inch shells, Copeland ordered, "Fire torpedoes." all 3 torpedoes launched at a range of 4,200 yards from Chōkai. The Mark 15 torpedoes, each carrying 825 pounds of Torpex explosive, ran true. One struck Chōkai amidships. The explosion disabled her engine room and jammed her rudder. Chōkai fell out of formation, on fire, and listing. The destroyer escort had crippled a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser armed with 10 8-inch guns. At 0810, Copeland ordered his gunnery officer to engage any target within range. Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul H. Carr, manning gun mount 52, the after 5-inch gun, began firing at the heavy cruiser Chikuma at a range of 6,800 yards. The Samuel B. Roberts Mark 37 director computed corrections for the ship's radical, evasive maneuvers. Carr's crew maintained a firing rate of 14 rounds per minute. The pattern repeated across the engagement area. The destroyer Hull engaged battleship Kongō, firing 40mm anti-aircraft guns at the battleship's superstructure when her 5-inch ammunition ran out. The destroyer Heermann placed herself between the battleship Haruna and the escort carriers, trading salvos with a warship 20 times her size. The destroyer escort Raymond fired her torpedoes at battleship Nagato from 7,000 yards. 7 American warships fought 23 Japanese warships. They fought with 5-inch guns against 18.1-inch guns. They fought with torpedoes designed for submarine warfare against the most heavily armored surface vessels afloat. They fought at point-blank range, sometimes under 2 miles, where their lack of armor became irrelevant because nothing could stop the shells they faced. And they created havoc in the Japanese formation. But by 0840 hours, the tactical picture began to change. Not because the American ships gained any advantage, because Admiral Kurita, observing from Yamato's bridge, became convinced he faced Halsey's main carrier force. The confusion began with optical rangefinders. Japanese naval fire control relied on stereoscopic rangefinders with bases measuring 15 to 30 feet. These devices provided accurate ranging under optimal conditions, but required manual operation. Operators tracked targets through precisely aligned optics and manually computed range by measuring the parallax angle. The system worked effectively against targets maintaining steady courses at known speeds. But the escort carriers were not maintaining steady courses. Admiral Sprague had ordered constant course changes, varying speed between full and 2/3, zigzagging unpredictably. Japanese rangefinders consistently reported the carriers making 30 knots, impossible for vessels built on C3 cargo hulls with a rated maximum speed of 18 knots. The miscalculation cascaded through Kurita's tactical picture. Carriers capable of 30 knots were fleet carriers. The Essex class displacing 27,000 tons and carrying 90 aircraft. Fleet carriers traveled with heavy cruiser escorts and fleet destroyer screens, not alone. Therefore, Kurita's intelligence officers concluded the cruiser-sized vessels making aggressive torpedo attacks must be heavy cruisers. The destroyer-sized vessels must be fleet destroyers. Lieutenant Commander Tonosuke Otani, Kurita's operations officer, later wrote in his action report, "The enemy carriers demonstrated high speed and violent evasive maneuvers inconsistent with escort carrier characteristics. Destroyer attacks were executed with aggressiveness and coordination suggesting fleet units. Staff consensus estimated we engaged Task Force 3.3. Task Force 3.3 was Halsey's main carrier force. 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Kurita believed he had sailed into a trap. The American technological advantage reinforced the deception. The Mark 37 gun fire control system combined surface search radar, optical range finding, an analog fire control computer, and automatic gun-laying mechanisms. The radar provided accurate ranging regardless of visibility, smoke, or target maneuvers. The computer solved the complex ballistics equations continuously, adjusting for own ship motion, target motion, wind, temperature, and shell ballistics. The gun mounts received electrical signals from the computer and automatically trained and elevated to the computed solution. This system allowed the Samuel B. Roberts to maintain accurate fire while making radical 30-degree course changes every 60 seconds. Japanese optical fire control required steady platforms and predictable target courses. Against wildly maneuvering targets, accuracy degraded severely. At 0851, the Samuel B. Roberts engaged heavy cruiser Chikuma at a range of 3,600 yards, 1.8 nautical miles. Gunners made Paul Carr's crew fired 324 rounds in 35 minutes. At this range, even 5-inch shells could damage cruiser superstructures. Crewmen aboard Chikuma reported hits on their No. 3 gun turret, secondary battery directors, and forward superstructure. Fires broke out on the cruiser's butt deck, casualties mounted among exposed personnel. For 1 impossible hour, a destroyer escort fought a heavy cruiser at knife-fighting range. The Chikuma mounted 10 8-inch guns, firing 260-pound shells. The Roberts mounted 2 5-inch guns, firing 55-pound shells. Yet the Roberts' radar fire control allowed her gunners to score repeated hits, while Chikuma's optical rangefinders struggled to track the wildly maneuvering target. At 0855, Japanese lookouts aboard several cruisers reported torpedo wakes approaching from starboard quarter. The wakes belonged to torpedoes launched by Taffy 3's destroyers 40 minutes earlier. The torpedoes forced the Japanese formation to scatter, breaking their coordinated advance. Cruisers turned independently to evade. The formation's cohesion collapsed. Admiral Kurita observed his cruisers scattering under torpedo attack while destroyers charged his battleships through curtains of shell splashes. He had been fighting for 90 minutes. 3 of his cruisers were sinking or crippled. He had not yet sunk a single American carrier. At 0916, 3 14-inch shells from Battleship Kongō struck the Samuel B. Roberts. The first shell penetrated the aft engine room, detonating among the ship's reduction gears. The explosion killed everyone in the space instantly. The second shell struck the forward fire room, rupturing steam lines and killing the entire watch. The third shell penetrated the hull below the waterline, flooding the forward magazine. The Samuel B. Roberts lost power. Her bow began settling. Water flooded through the 40-foot gash in her starboard side. At gun mount 5-2, Paul Carr continued firing. The mount had fired 324 rounds. The 5-inch 38 gun was rated for 325 rounds before the barrel required replacement due to wear. Carr loaded round 325. As he attempted to close the breech, the overheated mechanism jammed. The round detonated in the loading tray. The explosion killed Carr and his entire gun crew. The blast severed Carr's right arm and opened his abdomen. When damage control parties reached the mount, they found Carr still attempting to load another round with his remaining arm, asking, "Can we still fire?" He died minutes later. At 0925, Admiral Kurita issued the order that defined the battle's outcome. All units, cease action and retire northward. Japanese Vice Admiral Ugaki Matome, commanding Battleship Division 1 from Yamato, recorded in his diary, at 0920, received order to cease action and withdraw. Enemy carrier force had demonstrated capability inconsistent with escort carriers. Estimated we engaged fleet carrier force with full destroyer screen. 3 cruisers lost, 2 battleships damaged, objective not achieved. Staff recommended withdrawal to avoid engagement with Halsey's full force. Kurita had withdrawn with victory minutes away. The escort carriers were within gun range. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts were sinking or fleeing. He possessed 4 undamaged battleships, 5 operational cruisers, and 9 destroyers. He faced 6 escort carriers with no armor and diminishing air groups. But he believed he faced fleet carriers. He believed his damaged cruisers proved he fought heavy cruisers, not destroyers. He believed the suicidal torpedo attacks could only come from fleet units. The Americans had won through technological advantage and psychological deception. Their radar fire control systems allowed them to fight effectively while maneuvering violently. Their violent maneuvering made Japanese optical rangefinders report impossible speeds. Those impossible speeds convinced Kurita he faced Halsey's trap. 7 tin cans had defeated 23 capital ships by making the enemy believe they were titans. The journey to these divergent capabilities began in the late 1930s, when both American and Japanese naval architects confronted the fundamental problem of fire control: how to place shells on distant, maneuvering targets from own platforms executing radical evasive maneuvers. The Japanese solution emphasized human expertise. Their Type 94 fire control system, installed on battleships and heavy cruisers, relied on large-base stereoscopic rangefinders combined with highly trained operators. The Yamato's primary rangefinder measured 50 feet in length and weighed 12 tons. Operators who could reliably measure ranges to 30,000 yards trained for years. The system emphasized precision under ideal conditions, clear visibility, steady platforms, predictable target courses. The American solution emphasized automation and redundancy. Development of the Mark 37 gunfire control system began in 1938 at the Naval Research Laboratory under the direction of Dr. C.S. Williams. The requirements specified radar ranging independent of visibility, automatic computation of firing solutions, and stable accuracy during own-ship maneuvers. The system needed to function with crews possessing minimal training. The mathematics were brutally simple. A fire control solution required 7 variables: own range to target, own bearing to target, own speed, own course, target speed, target course, and ballistic characteristics of the shell. Changes in any variable required recomputing the entire solution. Manual computation required approximately 90 seconds per solution. Against maneuvering targets, solutions became obsolete before guns could fire. The Mark 37 solved the problem through continuous computation. The system's analog computer, the Mark 1A fire control computer, continuously received inputs from surface search radar, range and bearing, stable vertical reference gyroscopes for pitch and roll, own speed indicators, target speed estimators, and ballistic tables stored on mechanical cams. The computer output electrical signals directly to gun-mount servo motors, which automatically trained and elevated the guns to the computed solution. The entire process occurred continuously without human intervention. The weight penalty was severe. A complete Mark 37 director, including the radar, computer, stable element, and director structure, weighed approximately 30,000 pounds, 15 tons. Installation required reinforced foundations and extensive electrical cabling. Each director cost approximately $85,000, more than many small combatant vessels. Commander James C. Shaw, who oversaw Mark 37 installation on destroyers in 1941, wrote, "The system consumed weight and electrical capacity that designers preferred to allocate to weapons and speed, but in fleet actions, accuracy mattered more than broadside weight. A ship that could place 50% of her shells on target with a 4-gun battery outperformed a ship that placed 20% of shells on target with a 6-gun battery." The Japanese made different calculations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, reviewing fire control development in 1938, prioritized maximum broadside weight and engagement range over automated fire control. Japanese battleships and cruisers mounted more guns per ton than American equivalents. They achieved longer theoretical maximum ranges. They accepted reduced accuracy against maneuvering targets as acceptable because doctrine emphasized the decisive fleet engagement, a single close-range action where both sides would maintain steady courses for maximum gunnery effect. This doctrine assumed enemy cooperation. It assumed the enemy would fight the decisive engagement on terms allowing Japanese optical fire control to function optimally. The Americans designed for an enemy that refused cooperation, an enemy that would maneuver violently, hide in smoke, and fight in poor visibility. They sacrificed broadside weight for accuracy. They sacrificed theoretic maximum range for practical hit probability. They assumed battles would be chaotic, confused, and obscured by weather, smoke, and darkness. On the morning of October 25, 1944, off Samar Island, those design philosophies met in combat. The Japanese possessed overwhelming firepower, optimal visibility, and favorable tactical geometry. The Americans possessed ships barely qualified as warships, weapons inadequate for surface combat, and no realistic hope of survival. But the Americans possessed radar fire control, and that single technological advantage, combined with suicidal aggression, proved sufficient to convince the enemy they faced an entirely different force than reality. At 0935, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland gave the order no captain wished to give. "Abandon ship, all hands over the side." The Samuel B. Roberts had been dying for 19 minutes. Water flooded through the 40-foot shell hole in her starboard side. Her engine spaces were completely flooded. Her after magazine had been emptied by magazine sprinklers activated when the third 14-inch shell penetrated near the powder storage. She had no power, no propulsion, and no ability to fight fires. Her bow had settled until her forward 5-inch mount touched the water. Of the 224 men who had manned the Samuel B. Roberts that morning, 89 were dead. Paul Carr had died at his gun. Chief Boatswain's Mate Red Harrington had been killed by shell splinters while directing damage control. 37 men had died in the flooded engine and fire rooms. The remainder had been killed by direct shell impact. Hits or splinter damage throughout the ship. At 0955, the Samuel B. Roberts' stern rose vertically. The destroyer escort that had fought like a battleship slid beneath the surface bow first. She had been in commission for 5 months and 28 days. 120 survivors floated in the water. They had 3 life rafts among them. The water temperature measured approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent hypothermia, warm enough to encourage sharks. The survivors had no food, minimal water, and no immediate prospect of rescue. The battle continued around them. Japanese shells still fell among the escort carriers. American carrier aircraft still attacked Japanese warships. The survivors would float for 50 hours before rescue. The destroyer Johnston had already sunk at 0945, taking Commander Ernest Evans and 185 crewmen with her. The destroyer Hull had capsized at 0855 with 253 killed. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, hit by over 300 shells from Japanese cruisers, had sunk at 0907, killing 147. The destroyer escort Dennis had been hit but remained afloat. The other ships of Taffy 3 had survived, damaged but operational. Against Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, Taffy 3's 7 screening vessels had achieved the impossible. They had stopped the most powerful Japanese surface force assembled since Midway. They had sunk the heavy cruiser Chōkai, sunk the heavy cruiser Chikuma, which capsized after Taffy 3's aircraft attacked the crippled vessel, sunk the heavy cruiser Suzuya, which exploded after bomb damage, and damaged battleship Haruna, heavy cruiser Kumano, which would later sink on November 25 from submarine attack, battleship Kongō, and battleship Yamato. The cost? 3 American warships sunk, 3 damaged, 1,130 men killed. But the 6 escort carriers, the actual targets of Kurita's attack, survived. They continued supporting MacArthur's invasion at Leyte. The invasion proceeded on schedule. The Philippines were liberated. The strategic objective was achieved. The Battle off Samar demonstrated a principle that would define naval warfare through the missile age. Technological advantage could compensate for material inferiority. The Mark 37 fire control system gave American destroyers and destroyer escorts accuracy comparable to pre-radar battleships. That accuracy, combined with aggressive tactics and psychological deception, allowed 7 tin cans to defeat 23 capital ships. But the principle was purchased with blood. Seaman First Class Jack Hewson, floating in his Kapok life jacket among the Samuel B. Roberts survivors, later wrote, "We floated for 2 days. The sharks came the first night. We formed circles, kicking at anything that came close. Men died from wounds. Men died when they drank salt water and went mad. Men died when they just gave up. We sang songs, we told jokes. We promised each other we'd survive to tell the story, because if we didn't survive, nobody would believe what we'd done." On October 27, 1944, destroyer escorts from Task Unit 77.4.2 rescued 120 survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts. They were emaciated, dehydrated, covered in fuel oil, and wounded, but they were alive. Lieutenant Commander Copeland's official action report, submitted November 2, 1944, concluded, "The crew's performance exceeded all expectations for a ship of this type engaged against superior forces. The Mark 37 fire control system proved decisive in achieving accurate fire while maneuvering radically. The enemy's withdrawal, despite overwhelming material advantage, suggests psychological factors, specifically enemy belief they engaged fleet units rather than escort vessels, proved as important as physical damage inflicted. Recommend survivors receive unit commendation for extraordinary heroism." The Samuel B. Roberts received the Presidential Unit Citation. Paul Carr received the Silver Star posthumously. Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the only Medal of Honor awarded for surface action during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese never learned they had withdrawn from victory. Admiral Kurita's action report, declassified after the war, maintained his belief he had engaged fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. Japanese survivors consistently described their opponents as large carriers making high speed and aggressive cruiser-type vessels. The optical rangefinder reports of 30-knot carriers were never questioned. The assumption that only fleet units would execute suicidal attacks remained unexamined. The Americans had won by making the enemy's intelligence convince him of a reality that did not exist. They had won by leveraging radar fire control to fight effectively despite impossible odds. They had won through courage, sacrifice, and audacity. But victory came at the cost of 1,130 lives and 4 warships. The tin cans stopped the battleships, but the tin cans died doing it. The final accounting of the Battle off Samar reveals the magnitude of what Taffy 3 accomplished through technology and determination. American forces engaged: 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Total displacement approximately 75,000 tons. Total major caliber guns 21 5-inch weapons. Maximum gun range approximately 18,000 yards. Japanese forces engaged: 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, total displacement approximately 380,000 tons. Total major caliber guns 138 weapons ranging from 5-inch to 18.1-inch. Maximum gun range approximately 42,000 yards. Yamato's 18.1-inch main battery. The force ratio represented approximately 5-to-1 in tonnage, 6.5-to-1 in major caliber weapons, and 2.3-to-1 in range. American losses: USS Johnston, DD-557, sunk October 25, 09, 45 hours, 185 killed. USS Hull, DD-533, sunk October 25, 08, 55 hours, 253 killed. USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE-413, sunk October 25, 09, 55 hours, 89 killed. USS Gambier Bay, CVE-73, sunk October 25, 09, 07 hours, 147 killed. Total killed 1,130 men. Japanese losses: heavy cruiser Chōkai, disabled by torpedo hit from Samuel B. Roberts, scuttled October 25, approximately 190 killed. Heavy cruiser Chikuma, disabled by gunfire and torpedo hits from multiple destroyers and destroyer escorts, sunk by carrier aircraft October 25, approximately 900 killed. Heavy cruiser Suzuya, damaged by near-miss bomb, abandoned and scuttled October 25, approximately 390 killed. Heavy cruiser Kumano, bow blown off by torpedo hit from Johnston, later sunk by submarine and aircraft November 25, approximately 440 killed total. Battleship Haruna, damaged by bomb hits, required repairs. Kongō, minor damage from 5-inch shell hits. Battleship Yamato, no significant damage. Total killed in immediate battle, approximately 1,480 men. The exchange ratio slightly favored Japan in casualties, 1,130 American dead versus 1,480 Japanese dead. But the strategic outcome overwhelmingly favored the United States. The 6 escort carriers survived. The Leyte invasion proceeded. Japanese naval power in the Philippines was broken. Kurita's center force retreated and never again threatened American operations. The technological factor proved decisive. Examination of Japanese action reports after the war revealed the extent to which radar fire control shaped the engagement. Captain Toshio Abe, commanding the heavy cruiser Tone, wrote, quote, "American destroyer-type vessels maintained accurate fire during violent evasive maneuvers that should have made effective fire control impossible." End quote. This suggested either fleet destroyers with superior fire control systems or some technological advantage unknown to Japanese intelligence. End quote. That technological advantage was the Mark 37 system. Post-war analysis by the Naval Technical Mission to Japan concluded, quote, "Japanese optical fire control achieved superior accuracy against steady targets at maximum range under optimal visibility. American radar fire control achieved superior accuracy against maneuvering targets at medium range under all visibility conditions." End quote. In the chaotic close-range engagement off Samar, American systems proved tactically superior despite Japanese theoretical advantages. The broader lesson extended beyond fire control. The battle off Samar demonstrated that technological advantages, radar, automated computation, redundant sensors, could compensate for material inferiority when combined with aggressive tactics. This principle would define Cold War naval doctrine. American destroyers and destroyer escorts would not need to match Soviet cruisers ton for ton if they could outshoot them through superior sensors and fire control. The comparative analysis reveals the philosophical divide. American destroyer escorts of the John C. Butler class, exemplified by the Samuel B. Roberts, prioritized crew survivability and sensor capability. Displacement, 1,745 tons. Length, 306 feet. Armament: 2 times 5-inch 38 caliber guns, 3 times 40 mm quad mounts, 10 times 20 mm guns, 3 times 21-inch torpedo tubes. Fire control: Mark 37 radar director with Mark 1A computer. Armor: splinter plating only. Crew: 224 men. Maximum speed: 24 knots. Achieved 28 knots when pressed. Cost: approximately $4.2 million. Construction time: 5-6 months. Japanese Akazuki-class destroyers, the closest equivalent in mission profile, prioritized anti-aircraft capability and speed. Displacement: 2,701 tons. Length: 440 feet. Armament: 8 times 3.9-inch 65 caliber guns in twin turrets, 4 times 25 mm guns, 8 times 24-inch torpedo tubes. Fire control: Type 94 optical director. Armor: minimal splinter protection. Crew: 315 men. Maximum speed: 33 knots. Cost: approximately $5.8 million equivalent. Construction time: 12-15 months. The American design sacrificed speed and firepower for radar fire control and rapid construction. The Japanese design prioritized speed and broadside weight. In the chaotic engagement off Samar, where visibility was compromised by smoke, weather, and gun flashes, the American radar fire control proved decisive. The Japanese Type 94 optical directors struggled to track violently maneuvering targets through smoke and rain squalls. The numbers tell the story. American destroyer escorts engaged Japanese cruisers at ranges from 2,000 to 7,000 yards, knife fighting range where armor advantages meant nothing but fire control meant everything. The Mark 37 systems allowed American gunners to maintain accuracy while executing 30-degree course changes every 60 seconds. Japanese optical directors required relatively stable platforms for effective tracking. When forced to choose between accurate fire and evasive maneuvers, Japanese cruisers chose evasion and sacrificed accuracy. American destroyers executed both simultaneously. Of the 224 men aboard the Samuel B. Roberts on October 25, 1944, 89 died in combat and 15 more died during the 50 hours floating in the Philippine Sea. The final survivor count: 120 men rescued on October 27. The survival rate: 53.6%, remarkably high for a ship that suffered catastrophic damage and sank in 20 minutes. By comparison, the destroyer Johnston lost 185 of her 327-man crew, a 43.4% survival rate. The destroyer Hull lost 253 of approximately 330 men, a 23.3% survival rate. The escort carrier Gambier Bay lost 247 of approximately 860 men, an 82.9% survival rate. The variation reflected different damage patterns. The Johnston and Hull remained under intense fire until they sank, preventing organized abandonment. The Gambier Bay sank slowly, allowing orderly evacuation. The Samuel B. Roberts, struck by 3 14-inch shells that destroyed her engineering spaces but left her hull relatively intact, sank slowly enough for organized abandonment but catastrophically enough to kill everyone in the engineering spaces instantly. The human cost transcended statistics. Radio man Third Class Tullio Serafini, who survived, later wrote, "We knew we were going to die when Copeland gave the order to attack. You don't charge battleships in a tin can and expect to go home. But we also knew that if we didn't charge, those carriers were dead. So we charged, and somehow most of us survived. But the guys who died, Paul Carr firing his gun until it exploded, Red Harrington keeping damage control going until a shell took him, they're the ones who won that battle. We just lived to tell about it." The examination of the wreckage at 22,621 feet below the surface provided the final proof of what occurred on October 25, 1944. Victor Vescovo's submersible documented the Samuel B. Roberts' final resting position on the seafloor. The ship lay upright, bow pointing southwest, the direction she had been heading when the 14-inch shells from Kongō struck. Her gun mounts remained trained to starboard, aimed at the bearing where Chikuma had been engaging her. Gun mount 5-2, where Paul Carr had died, showed catastrophic blast damage consistent with a powder explosion. The 40-foot shell hole in the starboard side revealed the massive structural damage that sank the ship in 20 minutes. The wreck confirmed the battle damage reports. 3 14-inch shell hits, multiple 8-inch shell hits from cruiser secondary batteries, numerous splinter damage impacts from near misses. The forward 5-inch mount showed barrel wear consistent with firing 200-plus rounds. The aftermount showed destruction consistent with internal explosion. The torpedo mount showed all 3 tubes empty. The fish had been fired. The depth, 22,621 feet, made the Samuel B. Roberts the deepest shipwreck ever located. The Titanic rests at 12,500 feet. The German battleship Bismarck lies at 15,700 feet. The Samuel B. Roberts lies merely 2 miles deeper, in eternal darkness that even submersibles penetrate only briefly. But on the morning of October 25, 1944, the Samuel B. Roberts had operated in bright, tropical sunlight, charging into a forest of shell splashes toward ships that could have obliterated her with a single salvo. The contrast between that bright morning and the eternal darkness of her final rest captures the essence of her story: brief, violent, brilliant courage, followed by silence. The Battle off Samar ended the threat to the Leyte invasion. MacArthur's forces secured the beachheads, advanced inland, and eventually liberated the entire Philippines. The Japanese combined fleet never again challenged American naval supremacy. The loss of 3 heavy cruisers, combined with aircraft carrier losses at the Battle of Cape Engano, fought simultaneously north of Samar, crippled Japanese naval aviation and surface capabilities permanently. The strategic impact justified the tactical cost, but the lesson transcended strategy. The Samuel B. Roberts was not poorly designed. She was brilliantly designed to hunt submarines, escort convoys, and provide anti-aircraft defense for slow-moving merchant vessels. Her weapons were entirely adequate for her intended mission. Her armor was appropriate for her role. Her fire control system was the most sophisticated anti-submarine sensor suite available in 1944. None of those design parameters included fighting battleships. Yet when circumstances demanded the impossible, the Samuel B. Roberts charged battleships with submarine guns, and through tactical aggression, technological advantage, and psychological deception, she helped drive away the most powerful surface fleet Japan could assemble. The radar fire control system, designed to track U-boats at night, instead tracked heavy cruisers through smoke and rain. The 5-inch guns designed to sink surfaced submarines instead knocked out cruiser gun turrets. The torpedoes designed to depth charge surfaced U-boats instead crippled 13,000-ton heavy cruisers. The ship's company made the difference. Lieutenant Commander Copeland's decision to attack, Paul Carr's determination to keep firing until his gun exploded, Red Harrington's damage control leadership, Chief Engineer Roberts' decision to push the engines past their design limits, every man who chose to charge rather than retreat. Those choices were not suicidal, they were calculated. Copeland understood that aggressive attack created confusion and forced errors. He understood that radar fire control system gave his outgunned ship accuracy advantages at close range. He understood that torpedo threats would disrupt Japanese formation integrity. He understood that every minute he delayed Kurita was another minute for the escort carriers to launch aircraft and run. The mathematics supported the decision. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts could not defeat 4 battleships in sustained combat, but they could create sufficient chaos, threaten sufficient damage, and display sufficient aggression to convince the enemy he faced fleet units rather than escort vessels. And that deception, enabled by radar-directed accurate fire from violently maneuvering platforms, proved sufficient. Admiral Kurita withdrew because his intelligence told him he fought fleet carriers making 30 knots and heavy cruisers executing coordinated torpedo attacks. His optical rangefinders and experienced observers reported these facts. His staff consensus accepted these facts. His decision to withdraw reflected rational response to what his sensors told him he faced. His sensors lied, but they lied because American radar fire control allowed destroyer escorts to fight like heavy cruisers, and because American escort carriers squeezed 18 knots from 18-knot hulls, and because American sailors attacked when doctrine said to retreat. The Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, now rests at 22,621 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea. She rests with 89 of her crew. She rests in eternal darkness, far from the tropical sunlight where she fought her impossible battle. But on October 25, 1944, for 3 hours and 18 minutes, she was the most dangerous warship in the Pacific, not because of her guns or her armor or her size, because of her crew, her technology, and her captain's willingness to charge when every doctrine said to retreat. That remains the standard by which all naval heroism is measured. Not the size of the guns, not the thickness of the armor, not the tonnage or the speed or the theoretical maximum range. The willingness to charge when everything says to retreat. The skill to make technology compensate for overwhelming material disadvantage. The courage to face certain death for a tactical objective that serves strategic necessity. The destroyer escort that fought like a battleship proved that audacity, technology, and sacrifice can defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful. That lesson remains fundamental to naval doctrine 80 years later. The Samuel B. Roberts earned her place in history not by surviving, but by choosing to fight when survival was impossible. And in that single decision, Copeland's order at 0750 on October 25, 1944, all ahead flank, we're going in, lies the entire story of how 7 tin cans defeated 23 capital ships, saved 6 escort carriers, secured the Leyte invasion, and proved that courage and technology together can achieve the impossible.